The gunshot echoed through the Colorado mountains, startling a flock of birds into flight as Elizabeth Harrington's heart sank to her stomach. The year was 1875, and her father's gambling debts had just sealed her fate as surely as the bullet that had struck the pine tree behind her. She stood trembling on the porch of their modest homestead, watching the ruthless cattle baron August Blackwell tuck his smoking pistol back into its holster while her father cowered nearby. "The papers are drawn up," Blackwell announced, his gray mustache twitching with satisfaction. "Your daughter for your debts, Harrington. I need a wife to manage my household, and she'll do nicely." Elizabeth's fingers curled into fists, her 20-year-old frame rigid with defiance despite the tears threatening to spill. "Father, you cannot mean to sell me like cattle." Harold Harrington couldn't meet his daughter's eyes. Once a respected rancher, his weakness for cards and whiskey had reduced him to this desperate bargain. "I'm sorry, Lizzie. I've got no choice. You'll have a good life at Blackwell Ranch better than I can give you now." Blackwell's men were already loading her trunks onto their wagon. She had 3 days to prepare for a wedding she never chose, to a man 30 years her senior with a reputation for cruelty that extended throughout the territory. "Sign," Blackwell commanded, thrusting the papers at her father. As Harold's shaking hand completed the transaction, Elizabeth fled to the barn where she collapsed against her favorite mare's stall. Chestnut nickered softly, pressing her velvet nose against Elizabeth's tear-streaked face. "I cannot do this," she whispered. "I will not." That night, after her father had fallen into a drunken stupor, Elizabeth packed her saddlebags with essentials. Clothing, her mother's silver hairbrush, a small pistol, and the meager savings she had hidden beneath a loose floorboard. By dawn, she was riding Chestnut hard toward the mining town of Silver Creek, 30 miles north. She had one hope: her mother's cousin Mabel, who ran the town's only reputable boarding house. If anyone would hide her, it would be Mabel. The journey was punishing. Storm clouds gathered ominously as Elizabeth pushed through steep mountain passes, the June weather unpredictable in this part of Colorado territory. When the skies finally broke, she sought shelter beneath a rocky overhang, shivering as she pulled her woolen cape tighter. "Come on, girl," she urged her horse after the worst had passed. "Just a few more miles." By dusk, Silver Creek's ramshackle buildings appeared in the valley below. Elizabeth nearly wept with relief. The mining town was rough but bustling with activity as she guided Chestnut down the muddy Main Street. Men in dirty work clothes stopped to stare at the bedraggled young woman riding alone. Elizabeth kept her eyes forward, ignoring the whispers. Mabel's boarding house stood at the far end of town, its white clapboard a welcome sight among the weathered storefronts and saloons. She had just dismounted when a gruff voice called out behind her, "Miss Harrington." Elizabeth whirled around, her hand instinctively moving toward her hidden pistol. A man stepped from the shadows of the adjacent livery stable. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a face partially obscured by the brim of his worn Stetson. "How do you know my name?" she demanded, backing toward Mabel's front steps. "Nathan Xavier," he introduced himself, keeping a respectful distance. "I work for your father, or did. I quit this morning when I heard what he agreed to." Elizabeth studied him suspiciously. She vaguely recalled seeing him among the ranch hands, though he'd only been hired a few months prior. "What do you want?" "To help," he said simply. "Blackwell's men are already searching for you. They'll be here by morning." "Why would you help me?" Elizabeth challenged, even as dread pooled in her stomach. Nathan removed his hat, revealing tousled dark hair and eyes the color of whiskey. At perhaps 25, he was younger than most of her father's ranch hands. Because no one should be traded like property, especially not to Blackwell. His jaw tightened. "I've seen how he treats those under his power." Before Elizabeth could respond, the boarding house door opened. Mabel stood in the doorway, her gray streaked hair escaping its pins. "Elizabeth, good heavens, child." After hurried introductions and explanations, Elizabeth found herself seated at Mabel's kitchen table with a steaming cup of tea. Nathan remained standing, hat in hand, as he outlined what he knew. "Blackwell's offering $100 to anyone who returns you," he explained. "Silver Creek isn't safe. He has business connections here," Mabel nodded grimly. "The man practically owns the mining company. Half the men in town would turn you in for that kind of money." Elizabeth's hands trembled around her teacup. "Where can I go?" "West," Nathan suggested. "Through Wilson Pass. I know some people in River Junction who could help get you to California." "But that's another 2 days' ride," Elizabeth protested, "and I cannot ask you to risk yourself further." Nathan's expression remained resolute. "Miss Harrington, I've seen what happens to Blackwell's wives. The last one didn't survive a year." His voice softened. "Let me help you reach River Junction. After that, you'll be free to go wherever you choose." Something in his steady gaze made Elizabeth believe him. She glanced at Mabel, who nodded encouragingly. "You'll need supplies," Mabel said, already moving to gather food. "And you can't leave until first light. Elizabeth needs rest." That night, Elizabeth slept fitfully in Mabel's spare room, dreams filled with pursuing riders and her father's broken face. She woke before dawn to find Nathan already in the kitchen, studying a hand-drawn map with Mabel. "We'll avoid the main trails," he was saying. "There's an old trapper's route through here." He traced a line on the paper. Elizabeth cleared her throat. "I'm ready." Within the hour, they were riding out of Silver Creek, Elizabeth on Chestnut and Nathan on his sturdy buckskin gelding. They traveled in silence until the town disappeared behind them, then turned northwest toward the distant mountains. "Why did you really leave my father's employ?" Elizabeth asked when they paused to water the horses at a small creek. Nathan's face darkened. "I've spent my life working ranches across 3 territories. Your father was fair until the gambling took hold, but what he did selling his own daughter," he shook his head. "Some lines can't be crossed." Elizabeth studied him, noting the faint scar that ran along his jawline. "You've stood against men like Blackwell before." A humorless smile briefly touched his lips. "Let's just say I understand what it means to have your choices taken away." They rode hard through the day, stopping only when necessary. Nathan proved a skilled guide, navigating the increasingly rugged terrain with confidence. By late afternoon, they reached the base of Wilson Pass, where they made camp in a sheltered grove of aspens. As Nathan built a small fire, Elizabeth unsaddled the horses. The physical labor was a welcome distraction from her thoughts. When she returned with an armful of deadwood, she found Nathan staring at the flames, expression distant. "You said you understood having choices taken away," she ventured, setting down the kindling. "What did you mean?" Nathan was silent for so long Elizabeth thought he might not answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "My father died when I was 16, left debts. The banker who held them offered a choice: my mother could marry him or we'd lose everything." His eyes met hers across the fire. "She did it to protect me and my sisters. Died 3 years later, broken by his cruelty." Elizabeth's throat tightened. "I'm sorry." "It's why I couldn't stand by," he said simply. "Not again." The following morning brought clear skies, but also the distant sound that made both of them freeze: hoofbeats, multiple riders coming fast. "Blackwell's men," Nathan muttered, quickly stamping out their fire. "They must have picked up our trail." Elizabeth's heart hammered as they hastily packed their gear. "What if they catch us?" Nathan checked his revolver before holstering it. "They won't, but if they get close, we'll separate. You follow this ridgeline east," he pointed. "I'll lead them west. We'll meet at Cottonwood Creek by nightfall." "I won't leave you to face them alone," Elizabeth protested. "Miss Harrington—" "Elizabeth," she corrected firmly. "If we're risking our lives together, I think we're past formalities." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Elizabeth, trust me. I know these mountains better than Blackwell's men." They rode hard, pushing the horses up the steep trail that wound through Wilson Pass. The pursuing riders remained behind them, neither gaining nor losing ground. By midday, they reached a fork in the path. "This is where we separate," Nathan said, his expression grim. "Remember Cottonwood Creek. If I'm not there by dawn, don't wait." Elizabeth wanted to argue but knew he was right. Impulsively, she reached across the space between their horses and grasped his hand. "Be careful, Nathan." His fingers tightened briefly around hers. "You too." With a final nod, he turned his buckskin west, kicking up dust as he rode brazenly into the open, making himself a clear target. Elizabeth watched for just a moment before guiding Chestnut onto the eastern path, which quickly disappeared into dense pine forest. She rode for hours, constantly glancing over her shoulder. The forest eventually gave way to rocky terrain with sparse vegetation. As the sun began its descent, Elizabeth spotted the silver ribbon of Cottonwood Creek in the valley below. The creek was swollen with late spring runoff, its banks muddy and treacherous. Elizabeth found a protected spot beneath an outcropping and made camp, too anxious to start a fire despite the evening chill. She tended to Chestnut, then sat with her back against a boulder, pistol in hand, waiting. Night fell. The moon rose, no sign of Nathan. Elizabeth fought against growing despair. Had Blackwell's men caught him? Was he lying injured somewhere in the mountains? Dawn was still hours away when she heard something moving in the darkness. She raised her pistol, hands steady despite her fear. "It's me," Nathan's voice called softly. Relief washed through Elizabeth as he emerged from the shadows, leading his buckskin. In the moonlight, she could see a dark stain on his left sleeve. "You're hurt," she gasped, rushing to his side. "It's nothing. Bullet grazed me when I led them through Devil's Canyon." He grimaced as she helped him sit. "They won't be following us anymore." Two turned back, one took a bad fall down a ravine. Elizabeth helped him remove his coat, then tore a strip from her petticoat to bind the wound. "You could have been killed." "Worth the risk," he murmured, watching her work with an intensity that made her cheeks warm. They rested until first light, then continued their journey. The terrain grew more difficult as they descended from the mountains. But by late afternoon of the third day, they spotted River Junction in the distance, a proper town with a church steeple and buildings that spoke of permanence, rather than the temporary nature of mining camps. "There's a stagecoach station," Nathan explained as they approached. 3 times a week, coaches leave for Denver. From there, you can go anywhere." Elizabeth felt an unexpected pang at the thought of parting ways. Over their journey, she'd come to rely on Nathan's steady presence, his quiet strength. More than that, she'd begun to see the kind of man he truly was: honorable, brave, and surprisingly gentle despite his rugged exterior. "What will you do now?" she asked as they rode side by side down the main street. Nathan glanced at her. "Thought I might head to California myself, start fresh." Hope flickered in Elizabeth's chest, but before she could respond, shouts erupted behind them. They turned to see 3 riders galloping into town, dust billowing behind them. "Blackwell," Nathan growled, recognizing the cattle baron at the lead. Elizabeth's blood ran cold. Somehow he'd guessed their destination and taken a different route, perhaps by railroad part of the way. "The sheriff's office," Nathan decided, nodding toward a building ahead. "Quickly." They dismounted in front of the small jailhouse, rushing inside just as Blackwell and his men reached the hitching post outside. The sheriff, a graying man with a weathered face, looked up from his desk in surprise. "Can I help you folks?" "I hope so," Elizabeth said breathlessly. "I'm being pursued by a man who claims I'm his property." The door burst open before she could explain further. August Blackwell strode in, flanked by 2 armed men, his cold eyes fixed on Elizabeth. "There you are, my dear. Your father is beside himself with worry." His false concern might have fooled others, but Elizabeth saw the calculation beneath. "Sheriff," Blackwell continued smoothly, "this young woman is my fiancée. We're to be married tomorrow." She got cold feet and ran off with this ranch hand. He gestured dismissively at Nathan. The sheriff looked between them uncertainly. "That true, miss?" Elizabeth straightened her spine. "No, my father lost a gambling debt to this man and offered me as payment. I never agreed to marry him." "I have papers that say otherwise," Blackwell countered, producing documents from his coat pocket. "Signed by her father, legally binding. The wedding's already arranged." Nathan stepped forward. "Sheriff, no court would uphold a contract that treats a woman like property." The sheriff frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Let me see these papers." Blackwell handed them over with a triumphant smile. As the sheriff reviewed the documents, Elizabeth felt despair creeping in. The law often sided with men of Blackwell's standing, regardless of justice. After a long moment, the sheriff sighed. "These appear to be in order. It's an unusual arrangement, but your father did sign, miss." "So you see," Blackwell said, reaching for Elizabeth's arm, "it's time to come home." Nathan moved faster than anyone expected. He snatched the papers from the sheriff's hands, and before Blackwell could react, tore them cleanly down the middle. The sound of ripping paper seemed to echo in the stunned silence. "No," Nathan said, his voice quiet but firm as he let the torn halves flutter to the floor. "She'll marry only if she chooses. Not because of some debt, not because her father signed her away, only if she chooses of her own free will." Blackwell's face contorted with rage. "You'll regret that, boy." His hand moved toward his gun. "I wouldn't," the sheriff warned, rising from his desk. "Drawing in my office would be a poor decision, Mr. Blackwell." "This woman is my property by legal agreement," Blackwell insisted. "No person can be another's property," the sheriff replied evenly. "Not anymore. War settled that question." He turned to Elizabeth. "Miss, did you agree to this marriage?" "No," Elizabeth stated firmly. "Never," the sheriff nodded slowly. "Then there's no legal claim here, papers or not. Now, I suggest you gentlemen take your disagreement elsewhere before I decide to start arresting people for disturbing the peace." Blackwell's eyes narrowed dangerously. "This isn't over." He turned and stormed out, his men following. Elizabeth released a shaky breath. "Thank you, Sheriff." "Don't thank me yet," the lawman cautioned. "Men like Blackwell don't give up easily. The stage doesn't leave until tomorrow morning. You'd best find somewhere safe for the night." Outside, Nathan helped Elizabeth mount Chestnut. "The sheriff's right. Blackwell won't leave town without trying something." "What do we do?" "I know someone who might help. Old friend runs a place at the edge of town." That someone turned out to be Abigail Matthews, a no-nonsense widow who operated a small inn and seemed entirely unimpressed by their predicament. "Trouble follows you like a shadow, Nathan Xavier," she observed dryly after he explained their situation. Nevertheless, she offered them rooms and promised discretion. After a proper meal, the first they'd had in days, Elizabeth found Nathan on the inn's back porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold and crimson. She joined him at the railing, suddenly aware of how close they stood. "You risked everything back there," she said softly. Tearing those papers in front of the sheriff standing against Blackwell, Nathan turned to face her. "Some things are worth the risk." The air between them seemed to change, charged with something Elizabeth hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge during their desperate flight. Here, in this moment of relative safety, she could no longer ignore the way her heart quickened when he looked at her. "Why did you really help me, Nathan?" she asked, needing to hear the truth. "At first, because it was right," he admitted. "Then," his eyes held hers, "because I couldn't bear the thought of you married to a man you didn't choose. Because in just these few days I've come to," he stopped, shaking his head. "It doesn't matter. Tomorrow you'll board that stage and start a new life, as you should." "What if I'm not certain that's what I want anymore?" His breath caught visibly. "Elizabeth," a gunshot shattered the moment, the bullet splintering wood inches from Nathan's head. They ducked instinctively as more shots followed. "Inside," Nathan shouted, pushing Elizabeth toward the door while drawing his own weapon. They stumbled into the kitchen where Abigail was already loading a shotgun. "Blackwell?" she asked grimly. Nathan nodded, peering cautiously through a window. "4 men, including him. They've surrounded the place." "Back door," Abigail directed. "Through the cellar. Tunnel comes out behind the livery stable. Used it during Indian troubles years back." Elizabeth hesitated. "We can't leave you to face them alone." The older woman snorted. "Been facing down men like that my whole life. Now go." Nathan grabbed Elizabeth's hand and they hurried to the cellar stairs. Behind them, Abigail fired a warning shot from the front window, buying them time. The tunnel was low and narrow, forcing them to crouch as they moved through the darkness. When they finally emerged, the livery stable was quiet except for the nervous shuffling of horses. Nathan quickly located Chestnut and his buckskin. "We need to leave town," he said as they saddled the animals. "Blackwell won't stop now. But where can we go? He'll just keep following." Nathan paused, a determined look crossing his face. "There's one place, my family's old homestead, about a day's ride from here. It's abandoned now, but remote enough that we could hide there until we figure something out." They slipped out the back of the stable, keeping to the shadows as they made their way to the edge of town. Once clear, they rode hard, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and River Junction. They traveled through the night, stopping only briefly to rest the horses. Dawn found them crossing a wide prairie, mountains rising in the distance. By midday, they reached rolling foothills covered with pines and aspen groves. Nathan led them up an overgrown trail that would have been easy to miss if you didn't know it was there. The Xavier homestead sat in a small valley, nestled against a hillside. The cabin was weathered but intact, with a small creek running nearby and wild roses growing along one wall. It was simple but beautiful in its isolation. "My father built this place," Nathan explained as they dismounted. "After he died and my mother remarried, we moved to town. I haven't been back in years." Inside, the cabin was dusty but sound. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and simple furniture remained covered with sheets. Elizabeth felt an unexpected sense of peace as she helped Nathan clean and prepare the space. By evening, they had a fire going and had made the cabin habitable. Over a simple dinner of beans and dried beef from their supplies, they discussed their options. "Blackwell's influence doesn't extend to California," Nathan suggested. "We could still try to reach Sacramento." Elizabeth was quiet for a moment, watching the firelight play across his features. "Nathan, when you tore those papers, you said I should marry only if I choose." He nodded slowly, eyes questioning. "What if I've made my choice?" she asked softly. Understanding dawned in his expression, followed by hope and uncertainty. "Elizabeth, I have nothing to offer you. No land, no money. You offered me freedom," she interrupted. "You offered me choice. That's worth more than all of Blackwell's cattle and land combined." Nathan moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "These past days, riding beside you, seeing your courage, your determination, I've never met anyone like you. I think I began falling in love with you the moment you stood on your father's porch, refusing to be sold." Elizabeth's heart soared at the confession. "And I with you when you tore those papers and stood for my right to choose." He raised a hand to gently touch her cheek. "Are you certain? Your life would be very different from what you've known." "I've never been more certain of anything," she whispered. When he kissed her, it felt like coming home. His lips were gentle yet insistent, his hands cradling her face as if she were precious beyond measure. Elizabeth melted into him, all the fear and uncertainty of the past days dissolving in the warmth of his embrace. They spent the next week at the homestead, repairing what needed fixing and learning each other's stories. Elizabeth told Nathan about her mother's death years earlier, how her father had changed afterward, drowning his grief in gambling and drink. Nathan shared memories of his childhood in this very cabin, his dreams of someday having a place of his own. On the 8th day, they rode to the nearest town, a small settlement called Willow Springs, where the local preacher married them in a simple ceremony. Elizabeth wore wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil, and Nathan had polished his boots until they shone. "I choose you," Elizabeth whispered as they exchanged vows, tears of joy threatening to spill. "And I choose you," Nathan replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Today and every day." They returned to the homestead as husband and wife, determined to rebuild the Xavier family legacy together. Over the coming weeks, they worked side by side, turning the abandoned cabin into a true home. Nathan found work breaking horses for neighboring ranches, while Elizabeth planted a garden and began raising chickens. Word eventually reached them that August Blackwell had suffered financial setbacks after several of his business partners withdrew their support, uncomfortable with his pursuit of a woman clearly unwilling to marry him. Her father had moved east, his debts eventually forgiven in exchange for his share of their modest ranch. One evening in late summer, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies rise from the meadow grass, Elizabeth rested her head on Nathan's shoulder. "You ever regret it?" she asked. "Standing against Blackwell, risking everything?" Nathan smiled, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "How could I regret the thing that brought me the greatest happiness I've ever known?" Elizabeth placed his hand over her stomach, where the first signs of new life were just beginning to show. "Our child will grow up knowing the value of choice, of standing for what's right even when it's difficult. Our child will grow up knowing they were chosen," Nathan agreed, his eyes bright with love. "Just as we chose each other." As night fell over the Xavier homestead, Elizabeth thought back to those torn marriage papers that had changed the course of her life. What had been meant to trap her had instead set her free to find love, free to build a future of her own choosing. And in that freedom, she had found the greatest blessing of all, a man who understood that love without choice was no love at all. In the years that followed, their family grew. The homestead expanded, and their reputation for fairness and integrity spread throughout the territory. When their children asked how they had met, Elizabeth would smile at her husband, and Nathan would tell them about courage, about standing for what was right, and about a love freely chosen that had withstood every challenge. And whenever someone in need came to their door, seeking shelter from life's storms, Elizabeth and Nathan welcomed them with the same words that had changed their own lives. "Here, you are free to choose."